0. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you on the 6th annual conference on behalf of the organizers, meaning the Faculty of the International Relations here at the University of Economics and myself, Chlupatý. The theme we shall tackle today, and of course you all know it, that's why you're here, is the future of supply chains, or maybe more general, and I don't want to be over dramatic, the future of globalized economy. Let me briefly present three issues, three themes that I personally consider crucial in this context, and these will in a sense designate the breadth and scope of the debate. And thusly we shall return to these in detail in the course of the two discussion panels we have for you. I'll ask for slide 1, or actually slide 2, because the first one is just an illustration of what you already know, and that is that there are significant, crucial choke points. We'll get back to that. But slide number 1, in a second, will show you that the global economy experiences periods of fast-paced cross-border integration. Number 2, please, in this sense. Yes. Fast-paced cross-border integration and periods of slow integration or outright disintegration. In other words, as it is the case in many aspects, areas of our life, when it comes to globalization, history does not repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And currently, which is the graphic from Harvard Business School, very good illustration, we are in the midst of the deglobalization period. Or that's the argument that you've heard, and I'm pretty sure, many times in the course of the past couple of years. To me, it's oversimplification, and I'm very happy to have a chance to ask our distinguished speakers for their take on the subject matter. To me, it's an oversimplification because, of course, there are areas where globalization, the cross-border integration, will most likely continue in a very fast pace. Let's mention, for instance, data of all kinds, of course, and finance and many sectors that actually rely on these. On the other hand, please, number 2. Thank you. On the other hand, when it comes to trade in goods, supply chains, one of the key issues we shall tackle today, most likely there will be some disintegration, or at least rebalance, restructuring of supply chains, the very complex and long supply chains as we know them today. These shall be driven, or this shall be driven, this process, by numerous factors. We have, let's say, the pull side, meaning, for instance, technological advancement, technologies that allow for a substitution of relatively expensive labor for capital. And we have push factors, among others, geopolitics and the so-called weaponization of everything. In other words, the possibility, used and misused by many, to actually use the cross-border links to get what the player in question wants. This shall take a lot of time, of course. That's my point number 1. And point number 2, it is not available to everybody, despite the 8 out of 10, or more than 8 out of 10 firms inquired by Baker McKenzie, claiming that they are going to restructure either completely or to a very significant extent their supply chains. And that means, the fact that it is not available for everybody, that we will experience again crises, smaller and bigger ones, among other things because of the choke points that the global economy actually is exposed to. Please, number 3. These, and most of you are well aware of these, can be, for instance, the choke points in a form of maritime bottlenecks, let's say, like Strait of Hormuz, for instance. These are the points that if they get plugged, so to speak, can actually make the global economy slow down or even stop significantly. But it's not just the maritime trade that represents more than 80% of the global trade, speaking of volume. It's, of course, many other things, labor shortages, and things that are Britain, for instance, experiencing at the moment. And our first speaker is from Britain. She's going to talk to us from London, so we'll have a chance to actually hear the first account or first take on the subject matter, and a very personal one as well. Before I ask Beata and other panelists to actually share their take, I would like to ask the Dean of the Faculty of International Relations, Josef Taušer, for his open remarks, his take on the subject matter.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, it's a great pleasure to welcome you in the premises of the Prague University of Economics and Business on the occasion of annual conference of the Faculty of International Relations 2021. We started this tradition in 2014 with a goal to raise a debate on the Czech Republic's competitiveness and its future in changing global environment. And I am very proud that we continue in this tradition, and after 1 year break, I can welcome you again on another volume of our annual conference, this time dedicated to supply chains and unprecedented pandemic that hit this world so hard. Within our study programs, we try to capture new trends and challenges the world is facing and to discuss them with students how to address these issues on global, European, and national level. But I also see the role of the faculty and university in contributing to the debate within the society, to offer a ground for a balanced discussions, which I think is key for understanding issues that affect our lives. In 2019, when the COVID-19 virus spread and affected the world, we could hardly believe that it will take 20 months to get closer to the new normal life that we had lived before. The pandemic also changed the economy. Restrictive measures that countries worldwide introduced undoubtedly helped to save lives of many. At the same time, lockdowns and other restrictions brought the global economy a deepest recession since the Great Depression in 1930s. And now, some 20 months since the very beginning of the pandemic, the global economy starts one of the most robust post-recession recoveries in the history. The restart of the economy is, however, bringing new challenges, where supply chains are experiencing shortages, production is heavily affected, what has many implications on businesses, their outputs, inflation, etc. But can we secure the supply chains? Can the production be located in places with lower risks? Is this possible in a highly globalized economy? Ladies and gentlemen, surely these are some questions that are arising in this regard. And I am very pleased to have such distinguished panelists who will try to answer them with us. Last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to all who worked hard to make this event happen, as well as to our partners, the European Commission representation in Czechia, our media partners, Hospodářské noviny, Trade News, Investiční web, and Měsíčník Hospodářská komora. I wish you fruitful debates, and now let's start the conference. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask for the slide, if I may. So, very briefly, you all know and you're aware of it because there are two cameras that were live streaming the conference. There will be a recording. You'll be able to actually get to it, look at some of the key issues after the conference, again, on most likely the faculty's website. Jaro, am I correct? Thank you. And last but not least, second point, when it comes to logistics, you can ask questions, of course, the old-fashioned way, if you will, meaning raising your hands, or we have Slido, and you can ask questions using that. We're also asking a question that's pointed at you, directed at you. First question, or question that is regarding the first panel, is when will the global economy get back to normal? 23? Never. Okay, 50-50. We'll see. I'll definitely ask the panelists. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our first distinguished speaker, Beata Javorcik. She is the chief economist of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. She's talking to us from London, as I already mentioned, so we can ask, among other things, how things are in the UK, of course, in the context of supply chain management and future of supply chains. Beata, good afternoon. It's great to have you. Can you hear us?
Yes, good afternoon.
Brilliant.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Very briefly, just so you know, people in the audience, Beata will be talking to us for like 10, 12, 15 minutes, and then she'll take 3, 4, 5 questions, depending on your interest and time given. Beata, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. Let me share with you my screen so that, just 1 second, so I can share with you some slides. So I would like to say a few words about the ongoing recovery of the region, and then focus on 3 longer-term trends. So starting with the recovery, as we have just heard in the opening statement, there is a robust recovery taking place in the region. Central Europe saw decline in mobility, just like every other part of the world that was affected by the pandemic. But this mobility rebounded quite well by the late spring, early summer. And mobility matters very much because, as we calculated, a 10% decline in mobility shaves off 2% from the GDP. As mobility remained still subdued in Western Europe, demand for imports continued to be robust. So Central Europe benefited very much from this robust demand for its production of the manufacturing sector, as well as for its export of services. The big sort of question mark on the horizon is what will happen in the autumn as vaccination rates in the region remain relatively low when you compare to countries such as the UK or Portugal, which are the leaders on the continent. Now, let me move on to sort of longer term trends. I think one of the legacies of this pandemic is going to be increased importance of state-owned enterprises. SOEs will emerge as winners from the pandemic because they can always count on the help of their governments. And as we've seen in the previous crisis, for instance, the global financial crisis, while private firms are forced to shed labor during difficult times, SOEs can continue keeping people employed. So they will emerge unscathed from the pandemic. And this will happen with public approval, with public support, because what we saw during the last 20 years is increased public support for greater involvement of the state in the economy, in industry, in firms. And here you see answers to the question, do you favor greater role of the state in firms and industry? And you see answers given by respondents in advanced economies in 2020, prior to the pandemic, as well as 20 years earlier. And you see that over the last 2 decades, support for the greater role of the state in the economy has increased. If you look at post-communist countries, this support is even greater. It has reached about 45%. So almost half of the people favor greater role of the state in the economy. And you can see that this support is stronger among people who were adults or young adults when the transition started taking place. And if history is any guide, the pandemic itself, it's further going to increase this positive perception of the state being an important actor in the economy. And it is little known fact that public support for democracy is much stronger than the public support for private property. So as you see in this graph, in most countries, 3/4 of people believe it's important to live in a democracy. But if you ask people, would you want to see greater role of the private firms, private ownership in firms and in industry, actually the affirmative action, the answers, the share of people who say yes is in most places well below 3/4. So we are likely to see state-owned enterprises playing a greater role after the pandemic. This matters because they tend to be less innovative, they tend to be less efficient, and because they can be used by political elites to entrench themselves in power. So there are also political dimensions there. Moving on, the other observation I want to make pertains to accelerating digitalization and its potential impact on older workers. If you look at the share of people who purchased something online, it is 90% of people in the UK, about 2/3 in Central Europe, so new EU member states, and about 1/3 in Romania and Bulgaria and Western Balkans. In this chart, you see the share of people who purchased something online in 2019 versus 2020. So you see that most of the data points are above 45-degree line, which suggests that online purchases have increased in all countries, including countries in Central Europe. But there are huge differences if you disaggregate the data by education, by age, by income group. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to this red box here. It shows that if you look at people who are over 55 years of age, 2/3 of them in Western Europe purchase something online. But if you think about new EU member states, that's true of only 1/3 of them. And in Western Balkans, it's only 15%. And if you ask these older people about why they are not making purchases online, they will tell you that it's because they don't have the requisite skills. And the skill question or the skill issue comes up before they mention concerns about payment security. And, you know, if you look at surveys of adult skills, of the adult ICT skills, the picture is very similar. Young people in the region have skills on par of OECD, other OECD member states, but older workers in Central Europe lack in terms of ICT skills. And again, this matters because there is a real danger that this accelerating digitalization will push them out of the labor market, which would be a very negative development in the region, which is getting old before it gets rich. In the region, which is undergoing demographic transition, which is facing a lot of outward migration, and where labor force participation rates among older workers are already low. And that means that pension sustainability may become even more difficult after the pandemic. Finally, let me close with a mention of two opportunities. The pandemic has drawn attention to the lack of resilience of global value chains, to the fact that they are subject to shocks and that they may be subject to even more shocks going forward. And this creates an opportunity for new EU member states, as well as broadly defined European region, to replace some of the imports of Western Europe from China. There is actually a lot of similarity between what Germany imports from China and what countries in the European neighborhood also produce in areas where they have comparative advantage. My final point pertains to hybrid working, to remote working. Now that pretty much remote work or hybrid work has become an acceptable way of working. If you are sitting in London like myself, if you are a firm operating here, why not go a step further and hire people not just from London or not just from the UK, but people from other countries? Of course, there are limitations. You want workers to be close in terms of time zones. You want them to be able to travel and visit headquarters. And it's also very helpful if they are in a country which follows the same data protection regimes, data privacy regimes. This is particularly important for the financial sector. And all of this means that there is an opportunity for new EU member states to export more services, but export services by individuals, by means of individuals being employed abroad and being employed abroad as hybrid workers, as remote workers who on day-to-day basis work from their homes and then once every so often show up at company headquarters. So let me stop here and just summarize that the crisis has changed the economic landscape. It has created both threats and opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beata. Thank you. Now, before I give our audience a chance to actually pose a question, maybe one or two follow-ups. The first one, you mentioned that the current, let's call it simply reform, restructuring of the global value chains might be an opportunity, or it is an opportunity for Central and Eastern Europe and Europe in general to, let's say, substitute some of the stuff that is coming from China and Asia in more general terms. Now, what could or should economies, such as the Czech economy, small open economy, do to actually utilize this opportunity?
Thank you. So I think this push to reshuffling of global value chains will be fueled by two observations. The first one is that climate change is going to lead to more extreme weather events and possibly more epidemics, so more disruption. So there is a need for diversification. And second, that global trading rules have been weakened, so there is always potential for more trade conflict. So it's safer to be producing in countries with whom you have trade agreements or with whom you are in the same customs union. Now, this reshuffling of global value chains may not be happening immediately because it's associated with a need for increased investment, and often it's associated with FDI. And FDI flows so far have been actually quite subdued. So I would expect that this reorganization of global value chains will happen, but it's not a matter of months, it's more a matter of a few years. Now, what can you do to promote this? Well, at the beginning of the pandemic, some governments have started promising payouts to firms for reshoring. That does not seem to have worked well. So I would advocate more campaigns aiming at lowering informational barriers, informing potential investors that your country is a great place to do business. Investment promotion works and it's quite effective. And if you get it wrong, it has little downsides, because if you are not offering any financial investor incentives, then you are actually not spending a lot of money on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions for Beata? I don't want to hog her, so to speak. If Pavel? I am not sure. I will just, oh, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Pavel Nát. I work at the Faculty of International Relations. Thank you for your presentation. It definitely made me think. At the beginning, I was quite afraid of all those state-owned enterprises returning to this country. We've seen this before, and it didn't work very well. What's quite surprising to me is also your advice for supply chains kind of using our regions instead of China, because it leads me to a question about prices. How pricey would then German products be if the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Poland take the role that China has at the moment? And are consumers ready for this if we take inflation in the region already on a rise? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. So let me clarify. I think perhaps what we should be thinking about is not replacement of all imports from China, but rather diversification of import sources, China plus one strategy. Now, you are very right to point out to increased costs. Labor costs, obviously, in the region are higher. But remember, this is not about taking 100 jobs from China and placing these 100 jobs in the Czech Republic or Slovakia. Actually, if you choose to locate production in these two countries, chances are that the new production facilities you will be building will be much more automated than those in China. So they will not be creating 100 jobs, but the fact that they will be automated will mean that they will be less dependent on labor cost. Right? But this also means that greater investment is required, and hence my prediction that this will not happen very fast. Now, the second factor that will play a role is carbon border adjustment mechanism. If we are serious in Europe about the low carbon transition, we will need to have carbon border taxes, and that is going to create incentives for relocating of production as well. Thank you.
Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? If not, Beata, let me ask about the economic recovery and inflation. More and more, there's a concern being discussed that high inflation will translate into tighter monetary policy, and that can, let's simplify it again, mute the economic recovery. How real is this threat from your perspective?
You are worried about central banks tightening fast and choking recovery. I am a bit more concerned about central banks not tightening fast enough. So let me explain. There is a widespread belief that current inflation is temporary, and there are some reasons to think that that's the case. You know, we are emerging from lockdowns with pent-up demand. Everybody wants to consume, in particular, services because they were not able to do that. We saw big increases in commodity prices. This is all fueling inflation. Now, what makes our region special is the fact that anybody who is above 50 years of age remembers hyperinflation of the 1990s. And if you look at studies of how concerned people are about inflation, essentially these studies show that if you experience, a 10% inflation in your life, this memory fades after a few years. If you, however, experience hyperinflation in your lifetime, this memory will stay with you forever. So I am concerned that people in our region will be quicker to change their inflationary expectations. They will start expecting inflation, and this will lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy because they will expect inflation, this inflation will happen. And central banks, are younger, in the region. Central banks as independent organizations are younger. They've had less time to build up reputation. So there is some risk of inflationary expectations being entrenched, central banks not acting fast enough, and inflation becoming an issue for the region.
Just out of curiosity, Mohamed El-Erian, the economic advisor to Allianz Group and one of the prominent market voices, raised an issue of stagflation. To him, it's more and more probable that we're going to experience the combination of slow or no economic growth at all and high inflation. How likely is that?
Well, I think our region is well positioned for growth, and that's for two reasons. One, at the moment, this high reliance of manufacturing, which is higher than in countries with similar level of income, has served well. And, should pandemic come back, it's going to be helpful in the recovery. And second, the EU has made very ambitious commitments to low carbon transition, and these commitments come with funding. So there is a lot of funding coming to the region. The EU has made it clear that a lot of this funding has to be spent on building foundations for future growth. So in some ways, it's limiting the field of maneuver, the room for maneuver on behalf of politicians. So from the perspective of the region, I am actually quite optimistic. And, Central Europe has finished the phase of catch-up growth, right? For the past 30 years, growth was all about massive capital investment, was about importing technology. This phase of growth is over. Now the region needs to grow based on its own innovation. And I'm hoping that these inflows of funds from the EU will be spent partially to stimulate innovation in green space, and that this is going to provide a direction for the growth strategy for reforms, and it's going to fuel economic growth.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, last chance to ask Beata something, anything. If nobody's going to use it, I'm going to ask the last question, Beata, and that is going to be the one we actually are asking our audience. When will the global economy get back to normal? At the moment, 55% say the pandemic sets a new normal, meaning we're not going back. Then 27% 2023, 18% 2022. So where do you position yourself vis-a-vis the return to the normal or new abnormal?
Well, in terms of going back to the level of GDP per capita from the pre-pandemic period, I think the region is going to reach it at the end of this year. But I think there is no going back to the pre-pandemic normal. We've changed the way we work. We changed the way we consume services. So structural changes will be taking place, and they already have been taking place. And then we have this massive shock, massive transformation due to low carbon transition. So I think, there is no going back into the past. We are going to be undergoing big structural changes due to accelerating digitalization, the need for a low carbon future. So, this transition period will take a while before we reach whatever new equilibrium will be the new normal. So the answer is beyond 2023.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the Chief Economist of the EBRD, Beata Javorcik. Beata, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And I will ask two gentlemen that are going to present on this panel, namely the president of the Czech Chamber of Commerce, Vladimír Dlouhý, and the founder of Global Arena Research Institute, Michal Kořán. Gentlemen, welcome. Beata raised a couple of very interesting points, so before I actually inquire you on the subject matter, meaning the supply chain or global economy rebalance when it comes to its structure, I will ask you on a to briefly comment on what Beata just said. Vladimír, I will ask you first, and most likely you would address it anyway, but Pavel already mentioned it, the rise of SOEs. What do you think about that claim? Thank you.
Well, I was shocked. Interesting. You discussed many things in this country. Well, first of all, sorry, thank you for inviting me. It looks like a good place to be, and it looks like an interesting discussion. So, Roman, thank you very much for inviting me. I was really surprised. We are discussing many things during the pandemics, after the pandemics in this country. I don't remember that we would consider to be an important point to mention about the rise of importance of the state-owned enterprises here. Of course, they were better prepared to weather the pandemics. If it is just a state-owned enterprise, in terms of keeping people on the job, in terms of functioning, etc., and of course, obtaining necessary financing. Even the state-owned companies like ČEZ, which is the main power sector company, which is 70% approximately controlled by the government, of course, is doing well. But in the same way, large companies which were 100% private were doing well. Automotive sector, all those assembly automotive companies here, even the big banks, insurance offices, etc. The large companies were able to weather the risk to much extent. And of course, these were the small and medium-scale enterprises which are massively private-owned or 100% private-owned, which, especially in those sectors which are notoriously known, like the tourism service sector, etc., they suffered, obviously. But to conclude from this that there is a general perception that there should be an increase of the state-owned enterprises in this country, I consider a little bit to be either premature, which I hope not, or exaggerated, if I may say. And the last point I made a note here: public support for democracy, less for private ownership. I know that Milton Friedman is not very much à la mode for the moment, but this is his dictum. Without private ownership, you don't have free markets, and you don't have democracy as a matter of fact. So that would be my reaction to your question. I would have some other comments, if you allow me later, but you asked me, so I answer this.
Thank you. I'm sure you will have a lot of points regarding not only Beata's presentation. Maybe one short follow-up. You mentioned one big name, so let's turn to another one when it comes to economy, and that's Schumpeter. To what extent can we consider this experience, now I'm talking about the so-called pandemic, yet another episode of creative disruption, which at the end is positive?
Yes, but it is a kind of a cheap comparison because pandemics was an external shock and a brutal external shock. So this is not exactly, I'm afraid, what Schumpeter had in mind when he considered the general circumstances of the creative destruction.
Thank you. Michal, you, of course, you're coming from a slightly, or not slightly, from a different perspective, but when it comes to what Beata was talking about, what was interesting, surprising for you?
Well, first of all, also thank you very much for your invitation. I'm really honored to be here. Well, interesting was everything, surprising not that much, in my opinion at least. I would try to make 2 points. One about the state-owned enterprises. The data that we're looking at Gary, it's mostly UN data and World Bank data show that in Europe in general, there is continuing increase of people, of wage and salaried workers, and continuous decline of self-employed entrepreneurs. And we prepared some scenarios last year, and one of the scenarios precisely pointed at the fact that people might want to look for safe haven for their employment in working for the government, working for big corporations, working for the state-owned enterprises. And I find this very, very worrying, because it tears apart the very fabric of the society that I thought we were trying to build. Other data again show that especially in Central Europe, the rule of law is declining, the trust in government is declining. You know, we see that the corporate world is getting more ruthless. So, you know, giving up your own responsibility and happily work for a state that you hate, and happily work for a big corporation that you can't trust, it doesn't feel that it's going in the right direction. And the second point is the relocating and reshoring. And I'm absolutely far from arguing with Beata, but we have to see, you know, the sort of the reshoring back to the region and automation as a way of being less reliant on the global supply chains. It's an interesting concept, but I cannot see that in reality. First of all, there are already companies that can produce T-shirts in Germany or Adidas shoes in Germany for the fraction of the cost of what you would pay in Vietnam or Bangladesh. So you might reshore, but that doesn't mean that you're less reliant on the global supply chains, especially when you need to fix the manufacturing, you know, the actual vehicles and machines. One data, the average time that it takes to fix or upgrade your production is up from 8 to 150 days because of the supply chains crisis. So thinking that you're relocated and you're free from the global supply chains vulnerabilities is, I think, I'm not sure about that. And also, if everyone reshores and relocate and will start to regionalize or even localize the production, where are you going to sell your products? You know. So you can have a nice factory in Písek which will be fully automated, which this is my hometown, that's why I'm saying that. You know, some sort of textile, and then, but if everybody is going to localize, where is your market? So these are two points that I would keep in mind, other than the heavy investments. But other than that, especially the digitalization gap and the lack of research and development, that these were very important points that should be bear in mind.
Thank you. Vladimír, maybe let's tackle the issue of the reshoring or sort of partial transition of some of the manufacturing from China and generally Asia to Europe. How do you see it, and how your members, and I'm talking about the Chamber of Commerce members, see it, meaning is it an opportunity for the Czech business, and where, if there is an opportunity, where is it?
Well, thank you. I apologize. I will make a short detour first to your first slide you produced, Roman, at the very beginning about the waves of globalization and deglobalization. I have a certain disagreement that the first globalization finished in 1929. I believed it finished in 1913. And the first globalization, the second half of the 19th century until the start of the First World War, was of course driven by the very similar kind of events, I mean in terms of technological progress, new invention, not the very same thing, but the new invention, accelerating the transportation, accelerating the communication, new financial products, both in the second half of the 19th century and then after Second World War. And this has been supported by functioning of the gold standard. You might dislike, you might consider it a barbarous relic, but gold standard was an essential prerequisite for that globalization. And according to my opinion, this has been finished by the First World War. It did not work between 1918 and 1929, and because there was no gold standard, or the attempts were very badly functioning, contributed to the size and length of the Great Depression. And I always considered First and Second World War to be one war with 20 years of peace interlude. And that means that the first globalization has been finished by the long war. And after that, in the new circumstances of the post-war reconstruction, step by step, and as a matter of fact, only after Reagan and such a period, the real liberalization and second globalization started, and culminated in 2000 and 2008, according to my opinion. And it has not been finished by another war, thanks God. It has been finished by some kind of a self-saturation of the system, and by finding that the globalization creates new problems in the environmental area, in the unequal distribution of welfare, income inequalities, and you name many, many others. And from this point of view, I'm always saying that pandemics is not the game changer. According to my opinion, pandemics only accelerated many things. But all grains of change were rooted very firmly after the year 2000. And were clear also from the outset of the Great Recession, 2008 and 2009. So I'm sorry that, you know, that's my favorite subject, economic history, so I couldn't avoid myself not to mention.
Let me just quickly react to that. So would you agree with the premise that while the former period was all about, from the company's perspective, about margins, now it's much more, or it's gonna be about resilience? That there's a, you know, sort of a paradigm shift.
I hope it always will be.
We're talking about the primary aim.
Yeah, I hope it's all going to be about margin. I'm old-fashioned, unpopular, old conservative economist who still believe that the profits and margin will be the main engine of the human behavior in the business sector. But you might dislike me. I accept.
No, I don't. That's why we keep inviting you.
No. Well, good. It remains whether you will invite me next year. Remains to be seen. But can I go back to your question?
Now the question, yes, of course, and it's related, right? These are connected vessels.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and again, here I'm a little bit schizophrenic. I'm Vladimír Dlouhý, economist, and I'm Vladimír Dlouhý, president of the Czech Chamber of Commerce, which is also a very conservative institution. To put it in one sentence, no, we are not ready for that. We are not ready for that. I don't think that we will be able to compete in, using your example, producing T-shirts on a level of costs and prices fully competitive with Chinese production. And the only way is, again, what we have discussed in this country, in Central Europe, but as a matter of fact, in Europe, since 2000, when the famous Lisbon strategy, which disappeared, very few people remember what is it. Lisbon strategy was a strategy of Europe in 2000, that by 2010, Europe is going to be the most efficient, productive, progressive, etc., technologically developed region in the world. In 2010, we had a Greek crisis and the euro was on the brink of collapse. So what I mean is that even Western Europe is lacking behind in competitiveness, productivity growth, not speaking about our region. Beata mentioned, and I'm sorry that she's not there anymore, I understand she can't be, that the end of a certain growth of Central Europe since 1989. To some extent, she was right, but there is a big difference between Western Europe and Central Europe. a large part of population in Central Europe does not seem that growth is a matter for which they would vote.
She's still there.
She's still there.
I did not know that, but yeah, that's right.
She's still there.
I am here.
Very good, Mrs. Javorcik, greetings. And while here still we are living in this some kind of a catching up framework. I don't know exactly about the Polish wages, for instance, but a real Czech wage in 2004 was about 38% of the German real wage. Since then, while on the level of GDP per capita, even when you use PPP comparisons, we converge very solidly towards the European average. Now the real wage in Czech Republic is only 44 or 45% of the real German wage. In other words, in terms of the real wages, salary, the money what the people have in their pocket, the convergence was much slower than on the level of GDP. So there is even a political demand for catching up. And I am afraid, and Mrs. Javorcik, Beata, please do apologize me that I tend to disagree with you here. I believe that offshoring or substituting the Chinese imports to Germany by massively in an important scale from our part, we are not ready for that. What we need to do, especially in the most industrialized countries in Central Europe, that means mainly Bohemia, industrialized part of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, etc. We need to invest into the modern technology. And here I agree, despite the fact that I have 1,000 reservations about the climate policy of European Union, it is to some extent chance that we must be able to grasp the opportunity and the money which will be flowing in. And now I will stop here, but now I of course could continue saying that the climate policy which the European Union is imposing over our region is indeed shooting ourselves to our own leg and might generate very big problems. Maybe last sentence and then I'm going to be silent for a while. Somebody told me, some Chinese Singapore-based economist, I forgot his name, well-known personality, that all these climate change policies, all these policies respecting human rights, gender equality, etc., will mean a very large redistribution of the welfare. There will be gainers and winners and losers. And this country, together with some other countries in Central Europe, given their endowment, low endowment by the natural resources for renewables, given their heavy industrial structure, given their reliance on coal, gas, not having much water, not having much wind and sun, maybe Poland on the Baltic shore, we face a danger to be losers. And that's why, again, we must invest into those most viable, into the future technologically progressed sectors of the economy. I don't want to repeat those bloody slogans, digitalization, robotization, AI, because I hate those slogans now.
Beata, would you like to briefly comment, react?
Yes, absolutely. So I think we are not in as much disagreement as you make it sound, right? So incomes have not converged, but there has been a lot of catch up in terms of technology. And, you know, there is a limit to how much technology you can import. You know, at some point you need to rely more on your own innovation. So I absolutely agree with Mr. Dlouhý that we need investment, and in particular, investment in innovation. So we are not in a disagreement here. When it comes to SOEs, you mentioned that large firms have done well during the pandemic. Absolutely. Multinationals, tech platforms, large exporters, and SOEs. But as we have heard from the other panelists, smaller firms have done worse. So my point was that the relative importance of SOEs in the economy will increase simply because weaker players have been wiped out or are going to be wiped out. On climate change, I think you are absolutely to point out that you are right to point out that there will be winners and losers, and there will be winners and losers within countries as well, right? So even though, you know, this low carbon future is a better equilibrium, there is a transition path to get there. And as we move along this transition path, we need massive restructuring of the economy, you know, massive movement of workers from one type of activity to another. And, you know, as economists, we tend to sweep under the carpet the transition costs. And these transition costs are real. We've seen this with technological shock. We've seen this with globalization. And we do need to worry about the losers, and we need to take care of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Michale, let me go back to proverbial square one, the issue of, or a possibility of transition of some of the production from, let's say, China, so simplification, to the Czech Republic. When you look at the data, is something like that, the onshoring, really happening, or is it still more a discussion theme, let's say, a concept?
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid that the data is not quite out yet. So it's more of an academic question, and there are researchers among the CEOs and business leaders, and you have quite a diverse, I think you have just as diverse opinion on that as you have the general economist's opinion about whether it makes sense or not. What I would like to say, though, is that for the purpose of future discussion, it would be, you know, it's a little bit academic, but I think that it's important to keep in mind that global value chains is not only supply chains, and it's not only the logistics. That part of the global value chains is the demand. That the demand side is the production, and it's the customer, and it's linked with the logistics. And I think this is important because what we saw throughout the pandemics is that you had a demand shock first, you know, lower demand. Then you had demand shock, higher demand, and that's what clogged the actual supply chains. And now the business owners or the business and enterprises, they have obviously two choices. Either to try to reshore or shorten or make less complex their supply chains, or to make them more intelligent and more transparent and visible. And I think these are the sort of two, this is the frameworks of the debate that we will be having, and it absolutely depends on the particular industry that you know, which way you choose, or which, I mean, it's a continuum, obviously, it's not either or, but which way of the continuum are you going to lean to? So, yep. If I may, just one more thing to the debate.
Good, because I need to find something
cool.
on the tablet.
Well, keep looking. On the debate of the convergence and the green policy, we've done a sort of a robust study that compared the V4 region with the Netherlands, Austria, and Germany. And the only area of like solid and never ending so far convergence is the CO2 emissions, and we are constantly getting better in terms of lowering CO2 emissions. Obviously, it's because the base was really high. But I think that the region has done a lot over the past 30 years, and it has something to show, and it has something to build on. On the other hand, when it comes to the more economic or social convergency, it really stopped around 2007, 2008, 2009. It's clear that the crisis hit the region in a much more deeper way than the three sort of benchmark countries. And the three, in a very simple way, the 3 points that we see, what links to the non-convergency was, first of all, the rule of law and governance efficiency, that you see extreme differences there. And second, the lack of the sort of old money or the big capital, which is simply not here in the region. And it's not going to be here for another 50 or 100 years. I mean, so we have to play with the cards that we were dealt and figure out, you know, how to get out of that.
Thank you. One factor that definitely deserves our attention is labor force. It connects both to the economic recovery. Current situation on the job market is, well, unique, let's say, in many aspects. And of course, then in the longer term, when we discuss whether we are actually ready to utilize the opportunities connected to the tectonic shifts we're experiencing, again, it's about the skills, skill sets, and knowledge of the workforce. So when it comes to this issue in particular, Vladimír, what is your take on the job market and the potential for the improvement in this sense, both quality and quantity-wise? And we have one comment, or rather question, on this very topic, so I'm just gonna add it as an add-on, let's say, and that is how the CE countries want to stimulate economic growth if labor force shortage is heavily affecting production and governments don't favor visas for foreigners. In other words, there is much to be demanded from the government.
Well, not to be always serious, to make a light 30 seconds in the discussion, because I would like to show that we should distinguish a particular Czech situation, or maybe Central European situation, and the global situation in all developed countries, because all developed countries nowadays are facing labor shortages, at least in a structural sense of the word, maybe not always aggregate. Well, I've seen on the WhatsApp a picture. There were 2 photos in one picture, Boris Johnson holding a telephone receiver and Queen Elizabeth holding a telephone receiver, and Her Majesty asked the Prime Minister, "Of course I was driving a truck during the war. Why do you ask?" That means that we are not only country which suffers with the problem. But of course the problems in Britain are probably of a little bit different origin. In this country, again, the problem was here before. Remember, our unemployment went down very severely, and we all were very happy politically, socially, between 2015 and 2018. In 2019, before nobody knew anything about pandemics, we already were facing, in some sectors of the economy, a very strong shortage of qualified, even non-fully qualified labor. And we were sorting out the problem by importing the foreign labor force, namely from the countries which were culturally close, which knew the situation here, were close in terms of language, and the country did not represent a security risk like Ukraine and others. And let me, reflecting the question you mentioned, let me clearly say that in the short term of the next 2-3 years, I don't see any other possibility than to increase the issuance of visa in this respect. In the short term. In the medium and long term, it's our homework. It's the homework to do something what we have been discussing for more than a decade in this country. That is to change the curricula during the whole education system, starting from the very first grade in the age of 6, and finishing not only with the university degrees or the high school degrees, but lifetime education is the slogan. And we should do something, and here I'm not speaking for other countries, here I'm speaking for the Czech Republic. One of the most fossilized ministry in this country is the Ministry of Education, and unless the new government doesn't do anything about it, it will be the problem. it will be the barrier, the hindrance for the restart of the economic growth on the top of all other problems we have discussed. In general, I believe it's also now kind of a consequence of the pandemic, because when I speak to my Austrian colleague, German colleague, via the Eurochamber, which is now our European institution, even the Scandinavian, just people, especially from the service sector, left the service sector during the pandemic because there was no work there, and they are not ready to come back. Is it because of all those Kurzarbeit or furlough schemes, or is it because they found a job somewhere else? It is because they have an expectation about a new wave? I don't know. Maybe you have some more disaggregated data. I can build up only on the anecdotal evidence of the opinion polls among our members. And here the situation is indeed very, very difficult. But again, I will not mention the countries of one of our old Europe neighbor country. I have a hotelier from the mountains, so you can judge what country it was telling me that he had a big problem with his lady waitress, because during the high hours, 8 o'clock in the evening in the hotel restaurant, she wanted to have a break for having a cigarette, smoking break. And they said, no, you can't have a smoking break at 8 p.m. because the restaurant is full. And she just took an apron, she put it on the ground, and she left. And that was not Czech Republic, that was old capitalist country in the old Europe. So these are the pandemics, but in general, these are the structural problems, inappropriate reaction of the educational systems, not very flexible labor markets. Of course, we have Denmark with flexicurity. Of course, we have Switzerland. We have some countries which are doing much better. Unfortunately, Central Europe was not doing very well in this respect.
Michael, do you have any aggregate data you can share?
Not yet. I would
if you have, you would be a very rich man.
I think so, yeah. I'll try to. 2 points, if I may. One is following on that hotel analogy, and actually I had the same analogy here with the mountain hotel. Well, link it to the, let's say, broader or deeper social issue. Imagine exactly a little community somewhere, on the periphery. There is a family-run hotel, and the owner needs to invest into new heating system or to fix the roof. He has problems with the weight, with the staff, and he's waiting for fixing the heat so he cannot open the hotel. Now the cost skyrockets. And what he does, it's unsustainable. I think this is the question, the business continuity. Again, for the small and even medium enterprises, the business continuity will be a crucial question. But it's not only the business continuity, it's also the community service continuity. So this hotel will close. Some bigger capital buys it, sells it for apartments. And that's what's happening in the Czech Republic, and I'm sure in other places too. And now I'm linking it to what Beata Javorcik said about the age or digital gap, because in these communities you will have people who will buy the apartments or whatever, and they can buy stuff online. They can take a car, drive to for a nice meal 15-20 kilometers away, but you have the local people that will simply miss the old restaurant and the hotel. And I think this is an anecdotic sort of example, but this is another way of tearing apart the very fabric of the society, of the local communities. And you will find, social pathologies, political pathologies growing in these sort of peripheries. And I think this is something we need to be really careful about. I think this sort of localized effect is extremely important to bear in mind.
Roman, can I add shortly to this? I try now to make the Czech Chamber of Commerce, who represents mainly small and medium-scale enterprises. All big are our members as well, but we are seen more for the SMEs. I try to make it attractive, sexy also for the digital companies. So I'm talking to them, I started to talk to them very often now, very profoundly. And of course, they have people. They have people. They can pay, they can attract, but what they do, they educate them themselves. If I'm asking them, what do you need from state? And I said it on one TV interview 10 days ago, and after a long time, I got many positive likes on Twitter, because usually when I'm saying something in public, I'm getting negative comments. But I said, the digital companies ask for only one thing: educate people better and don't mess into our business. These are two conditions what they want. But they are doing well. They are the winners already now of the pandemics.
Sure. All right, thank you for letting me speak again. I would like to follow up on this. Because again, comparatively, the Czech Republic is surprisingly well off when it comes to tech education and tech expertise and techs among technology expert among the R&D. We are, again, comparing those 7 countries that I mentioned, the Czech Republic is actually the best off. Also, when it comes to exporting IT services and when it comes to exporting IT goods and merchandise, the Czech Republic has been growing steadily for the past 12 to 15 years, as opposed to Germany, which is actually declining. So we're not that bad. It's not that bad. However, I completely agree with the education argument. But, and this again links it to the old money and the capital, 90% of the market capitalization of the big tech or the digital platform is divided between China and US enterprises. So obviously, even though we export services and we export the stuff, the real capital doesn't stay here. So that's another thing that we need to think about. And absolutely last point on that, when it comes to investing into research and development, this is just one indicator, and I know that it's very controversial, but in the Czech Republic, while we more than doubled the money that goes into research and development, the number of patents is actually lower than it was in 1992, and it links it to the overall efficiency of government and translating the money into something tangible, which we are historically very bad at. Sorry for being so negative, Roman.
That's okay. I'll ask London for a positive take on the subject matter. Beata, when it comes to labor force in the CE region, how are we doing as Czechs? Give us sort of a map of the haves and have-nots.
Well, you know, I wouldn't dare to compete with local experts. But let me make a slightly different point. I think we need to distinguish between short-term shortages in the labor market. Some of these shortages are caused by the fact that the pandemic is not over. And, you know, in particular, women left the labor force to take care of children, to deal with homeschooling. And as they are unsure what will happen in the autumn, they may choose not to return just yet. And then there is the issue of longer-term lack of skills, and that's linked to this fast technological progress, to digitalization. And in our region, you know, this is further exacerbated by outward migration. In our forthcoming report, transition report, we looked at statistics of how many people are trained versus how many people remain employed in their countries. So then, you know, how do you solve this issue? Well, you can open your country to inward migration, like Poland did, or you can tap into the older workers. And the problem with tapping into these older workers, making people work longer, and here, you know, by older, I mean, you know, 55 plus, right? So not really old, is the following: low ICT skills and much lower labor force participation. If you compare the share of people in those age groups that are in the labor force, it's much lower in Central Europe, so you know the sort of transition countries, than in G7 countries. And this can be linked also to health. If you ask people how you rate your personal health status. You know, when you compare outcomes for young people on self-reported health, they are very similar between Central Europe and G7 countries, but they start diverging at about age of 50. People in the region feel less healthy subjectively than their counterparts in G7. Finally, let me just make a comment about good use of talent, about women. What we saw during this pandemic, you know, people talk about she recessions. So typically during recessions after World War II, men were more likely to lose their jobs. This was a very unique downturn because women suffered, right? And, you know, this was unique because we couldn't consume services, and service sectors are dominated by women. That's why women were disproportionately hit. But what people forget about is women who are able to work remotely, they also had to take a step back in their careers because the duties of homeschooling disproportionately fell on women. And you see it in time use surveys from very many countries. Now, you may say this is logical. At the household level, we compare the savings of the woman and the man, the earnings. And if the man is making more money, we should be prioritizing his career. This would not be a problem except that the existence of gender wage gap and the glass ceiling means that women often make less money for the same work. Now, this pandemic made them take a step back when it comes to their professional development. And this is going to further exacerbate this gender inequality in the labor market. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
Well, I am aware, even on the first hard data, that indeed in many countries women were hit more by the pandemics in a way as Mrs. Javorcik described. I don't have such signals so much from here. I even hear that, especially in the restaurant sector, in the service sector, in the, you know, these market chains and shops, etc., many women, but many men, for instance, in the restaurants, etc. here. So at least Prague and big city are more or less evenly distributed in terms of the negative effects of pandemics on men and women's jobs. However, where I agree very strongly with Mrs. Javorcik is that women are one of the very important reservoir which can be used because we have reserves on the market. It's not only even in the short term bringing in the Ukrainians. Our students, I think, are the length of study of the university student, if I'm not mistaken, in this country, well, the dean has left already, is 7.2 years. It's the second or the third longest period. Why the hell do they study such a long time? Second, women, especially on the maternity leave, etc. But also, I agree, it's the gender-based wage difference. Something must be done about it because there is a very great reservoir. And third are senior people. Women and senior people, also even the students, can be attracted by abrupt change in the legal framework of the labor market. Allow more contractual jobs on, as we speak in Czech, dohoda, short-term jobs. Even some kind of tax and other issues which allows people to be to increase the tax breaks and increase the breaks for social and security payments on the part-time workers, etc., etc. There are reservoirs. even for sorting out this short-term problem. In the long term, I agree with Beata. We agreed both that there is a difference between short and long term. From my point of view, long term, at least in a country I know, this is Czech Republic, is mainly the problem of the change in the educational system.
We have a couple of interesting questions on Slido, so let's just briefly comment or react to those. First, most likely for you, Vladimír, do you see wage increases as part of the solution to the labor shortages? Now we're back to short-term solutions.
Well, as I described myself as old, conservative, old-fashioned, the wage increase must be a result of the market conditions. And if I'm not mistaken, we are speaking about labor shortages, so the wages should increase because of the market situation. I'm strongly opposing the wage increases which are either directly or indirectly induced by the exacerbated either governmental or trade union policies.
Sure. Just to complement what was said, it's true that the Czech wages are comparatively on the lower spectrum in the European Union. On the other hand, when you look at those who are close to the minimum wage, we are the percentage of people that are actually close to the threshold is among the lowest. So what I'm trying to say is that you would have to really that the minimum wage would have to go really high, and that it doesn't look like that would be the solution. So I definitely would agree with that.
And the problem is that also we have also the system of the so-called guaranteed wages, which is divided into 8 classes or 8 layers. And these guaranteed wages, which represent a minimum for a certain educational class, beyond which the wage should not go. And each increase of minimum wage, which tackles only, I agree, very small percentage of people, but automatically also increases all the 8 layers of the so-called guaranteed wage. So it is inflationary at the end of the day.
Another interesting question, given what is going to be happening here on Friday and Saturday, in other words, elections. Can populist and anti-system political parties reform the economy and the state in a way it can react to challenges of the post-pandemic world? I'm going to rephrase it slightly. Are you afraid of the so-called anti-systemic parties and their short-term solutions and the impact of the short-term solutions onto the state and economy for both of you? And if we still have Beata with us, then I'll ask her to answer this question as well.
I'm talking too much. Why Mr. Kozan does not start?
It's a tricky question, and that's the only. I mean, how do you label populist? In a way, the mainstream is now much more populist than it was 20 years ago. So I think that we have a very strong populist being prime minister right now, and he. Okay, I will just decline here. I don't think that the anti-systemic party, that's a different thing. Here I am positive. I believe that that's not what's going to happen after the election, but I might be unfortunately proved very wrong.
Well, now I can't avoid the answer. You know, as a president of the chamber, I must be apolitical, but I will not be.
I knew it.
Unfortunately, well, let me start with following. Intuitively, we all know who is populist and who is anti-system party. So I don't have to name them. Unfortunately, there are too many examples during the 19th and 20th century European and world history that populist and anti-systemic and autocratic politicians, when they seize the power at the beginning, in the first 3, 4, 5 years, they can, as a matter of fact, reform the economy. If you ask every German in 1938 whether Hitler improved the economy, the overwhelming answer will be yes, definitely. But then there is a long-term consequence of all those authoritarian regimes. So here is the danger, and definitely I'm not saying that we are facing such an extreme danger in these elections. But what I'm saying that whoever emerges very carefully listens to all the things we are discussing here. My chapter has been organizing 10 roundtables over past 3 months with all the parties, even those who are not parliament, but which might resemble that they can make it, on 10 different important subjects: transportation, construction, pandemics, healthcare, finance, tax system, you name it. And also the parties whose names I don't want to mention, but whom we consider anti-systemic and populist, etc., anti-European. All they have, when they send their best people, they are sitting there, they are talking like you and me. Of course, this is a problem. We want to improve your education. We want this, we want that. And so be careful that even the most negative outcome in our eyes at the beginning might sound reasonable. It will be, that's the reason why it will be even more dangerous when it seems in the medium and long term.
Thank you. Beata, Central and Eastern Europe and political instability, let's say. Are you worried?
Well, I think the relevant question is not, who is populist or not populist. The relevant question is short-term versus long-term horizon. I think if there is one thing all of us on this panel agree on is the need for investment, including public investment in skills. Investment by definition pays off with a delay. So no party that has a short-term horizon will have an incentive to invest in anything that is long-term, in anything that builds foundation for future growth. So here, from this perspective, I very much welcome this initiative of the EU to tie the hands of elected politicians when it comes to what the EU money can be spent on. Now, in our region, there is yet additional twist, which is demographic changes. Not only are the societies getting old, right? They are getting old before they are getting rich. Also, younger people are less likely to vote. So as the society is becoming rich, as young people emigrate, suddenly the preferences of the electorate are shifted towards now and here. We want redistribution. We don't want investment in the future because, we are old and our children are away. So the way to change this is to mobilize young voters. They should have a say in, more say and more influence over the politics because their horizon is longer. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I still am going to ask one final question. I believe you will actually excuse me to do so. And that is how the economy is going to look like as a result of the experience we're having. And as you said, Vladimír, it is an accelerator of many trends that were around for years now. Meaning, what are going to be the biggest changes once we are in a stable or seemingly stable post-pandemic state or world? And it's a question for all three of us, and of course, to an extent, it is a follow-up to our question to the audience, meaning when the global economy is going back to normal. Vladimír, I will ask you to start.
I agree with Mrs. Javorcik that in terms of GDP per capita or GDP measured in PPP, etc., we might be at the level on the level of end of 2019, sometime end of this year, or maybe in the first half of next year. But this is not the most important question. I take your question where the economy is going to be. And I'm not going to say any year. I believe that in 5 years, we might probably see a more productive, more digitalized European economy, more efficient, with a completely different labor market, not in terms only of supply and demand, but also on the modus operandi, how people work. But I'm afraid that the income inequality and welfare differences at the beginning will widen, maybe not in absolute, but in relative terms. And I don't know where Czech Republic will be on this scale.
Thank you. Michale?
Okay, I will now succumb to the temptation to let, someone who is more focused on international relations security to speak. So, because I would obviously support everything that Mrs. Javorcik said and Mr. Dlouhý said, but I will say two things. One is the issue of digitalization. The flows of data was not the only, but was the major flow that dramatically increased during the pandemic, and so we are sort of seeing the trend towards more digital economies. However, there is one thing, and that's the tribalization of internet. Is the move towards tribalization of the, technologies. And if we do not pay attention to this, and I mean, first of all, Europe is nowhere at the playing table when it comes to digital technologies. So we'll have a lot of catching up to do. But if we let the digital world to disintegrate, and that's the path we're taking now, then the digital economy is not going to save us. So that would be one point. The second point is that we really should be careful about, and even in short term, about the food prices in developing world, but not only in developing world. Maybe you've seen today's headline of Bloomberg, the 4 meals away from anarchy in Britain, because it is hitting Britain very deeply. It might hit us too. It's definitely hitting economies like Vietnam, Turkey, Russia, Egypt. And there is a strong link between high food prices and conflict. So if we do not pay attention to this and we do not do the first and last thing to stop this, we might be having really different discussion here next year or in 2 years, because the world will be very unstable.
Beata, the last comment is yours. Maybe I'll ask you, Michal mentioned Britain, its current experience. I mentioned it in my introduction. What are the lessons learned, or what is, or should be the lesson learned from the current supply chain, to an extent, driven crisis?
Well, a lot of what is happening here shows is an illustration of benefits of trade integration, and not just trade integration, but also sort of deeper economic integration. And this European integration going into reverse, which is visible here, has some costs. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Beata Javorcik, EBRD.
Thank you very much for your attention and for the invitation.
Vladimír Dlouhý, Czech Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Michal Kořán, Global Arena Research Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you as well. Now a little refreshment over there in the corner of the room, and in 20 minutes or so we will have yet another great lineup of prominent speakers tackling the issue of supply chains. Enjoy. Prague. We are live. Greetings to our online audience. Let me introduce distinguished panelists. It is my real honor to welcome Bublu Taku-Weigold, Associate Director at ETH Zurich. Hello, Bublu. Sebastian Mirodu. I'm sorry, I'm going to read it because it's really long and complicated. Senior Trade Policy Analyst in the Trade and Services Division of the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate. Sebastian, welcome. And last but not least, Martin Jahn, Board Member responsible for Sales and Marketing at Škoda Auto. Martin, welcome. We just discussed with the panelists how should we proceed, how should we start, and the overall agreement is, or the agreement we concluded is that we are going to start with a follow-up, a comment on what has been said on the first panel. So without further ado, Sebastian, please, your take on the subject matter. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. At first, let me say that I'm very happy to be here. It's actually my first in-person conference since 2 years, so it feels a bit like being back to normal. So thank you for inviting me. So I think we had a very interesting first panel. Actually, what I wanted to say is something that was already said in the first panel, which is that we can see the pandemic as maybe accelerating some changes that were already there, and so that's right, you put the right slide to explain this, and I want to come back also. You started the conference with this slide, and the last phase was deglobalization. So I would like to explain what is this deglobalization. So we can all agree that before the great financial crisis in 2007, 2008, you had this period of expansion of global value chain, and it was the same for all OECD economies, emerging countries. And after the global financial crisis, that's where I think we can talk about the start of a new normal, or something that looks very different from the previous period. But what's important is that it's also very different trends across major economies. And you can see here that the EU is very different, because, so let me say what you can see here. It's an indicator which is called the import intensity of production. It's a complicated name for something very simple. It tells you for each dollar of production, how many cents of trade in intermediate inputs along all the value chain were needed. So, for example, in 2019, when you have a $1 produced in the EU, it creates 30 cents of trade in intermediate inputs. So it's an indicator of the fragmentation of production and the importance of global value chains. But we see that for the EU, we are still in a period of expansion of global value chains. So what is maybe different is that, especially in the recent years, this expansion is more for the intra-regional value added, whereas before you had more foreign input sourced maybe from outside the EU. Now they are maybe more sourced from inside the EU. And so my point is that what we discussed with the pandemic, it was suggested that maybe EU value chains would become more regional. I'm not sure of this, but if it's the trend, it's almost the continuation of this long-term trend. And it's the same for other economies. And actually, we say deglobalization, but it's mostly observed only in China. And it's a very specific development phase of China. So China had a very high level of foreign inputs in its production, but for such a large economy, it was somehow exceptional and related to its export-led growth. And now it has converged with the level we can see for the US. But again, if we talk about decoupling of a US-China economy, that would be also just the continuation of this kind of trend. So I don't think that the pandemic will be the game changer. Of course, there is a digital transformation, climate change, so there will be certainly some big changes, but not coming directly from the pandemic. Now, if we can show the second slide, is actually what maybe most people discussed related to some kind of short-term disruptions in the value chains. So here I picked the example of the semiconductor industry, which is really the one under the spotlights and where the shortages are discussed. But here there are two things that I want to illustrate with this data. It's just the annual change in exports for semiconductor for the main suppliers of semiconductors. So what you see in this chart, it's first, in 2020, you had more export of semiconductors than in 2019. So, of course, there are problems with these shortages, but it's a bit difficult to say that GVCs were not resilient when, during the pandemic, suppliers managed to produce more than before the pandemic. But then what you see in terms of short-term changes, it's really related to the dynamic of the pandemic. So in the first quarter of 2020, you had the lockdown of the Chinese economy, and you see that other Asian economies like Malaysia, Philippines replaced China for the supply. And then when China reopened its economy, you have a new increase for China and so on. But what I'm wondering, so we heard some conclusions maybe from policymakers, you know, there are vulnerabilities, maybe there are risks when sourcing from China, let's bring back the value chains to Europe. When I see this chart and I'm a supply chain manager, my conclusion could be different. Somehow it was more reliable to source from Asia, and a lot of the disruptions have been solved through more trade with Asia. So that's why we have to think that maybe the policy debate and what we see in the value chains can go in different directions. So let me just stop here for the introductory comments.
Thank you very much. Before I ask Martin for his comment, a follow-up, a short one. In this respect, in this context, what do you think about the strategic sovereignty and, you know, the sort of both Washington-driven and Brussels-driven, or Berlin and other capitals, European capitals driven, strive to actually onshore at least the strategic, the most sensitive materials, components, and so forth?
Of course, you have different policy goals. So if it's no longer about economic efficiency, if it's no longer also about resilience in terms of just being sure that there is security of supply or that you can address shortages or spikes in demand. If you start to pursue some other strategic objectives, maybe you can support such policies, but you have to be clear that you want to achieve something different than just resilience in global value chains, because all of our work is suggesting the opposite, that you are not becoming more resilient by having domestic production, but on the contrary, by keeping trade routes open and benefiting from the fact that your companies produce in different regions that are not affected at the same time by the same shock.
Thank you. Martin, Sebastian mentioned or listed a couple of buzzwords, I would say, semiconductors, shortening of supply chains, and so on and so forth. What is Skoda Auto's experience or take on the subject matter? Because, of course, you are part of the story that is being discussed in the mass media as well as by academics and experts on supply chains day by day, minute by minute, I would even say.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be at my alma mater more than a quarter of a century after I graduated from this faculty, so it's always a pleasure to be here. And my comments, the charts. Well, first of all, let me explain how did we get into this mess. And I need to say this is not just event, this is really a series of unfortunate events. What happened when the pandemic hit the world? First of all, everybody expected that the demand for cars will go strongly down. So even the chip producers reduced their readiness to produce chips for automotive. In reality, the markets recovered relatively quickly, especially China, and also people realized that the passenger car is much better in pandemics than to travel with public transportation, so the demand for cars was bouncing back actually faster than people expected. At the same time, because of the long lockdowns, people increased the use of consumer electronics for entertainment, for work at home, and so on. So the need for chips also in other devices basically also skyrocketed. So you had this mismatch between supply and demand, which led basically to a lower supply of chips that was necessary. And then you had the unfortunate events. You had the weather disaster in Texas in February. Then you had a big fire in Renesas factory in Japan, which is also an important chip producer, which basically kicked down 2 important production facilities, and such a kick down takes a long time to recover. Before you recover the production equipment and the people and everything, it just takes weeks. So you have weeks of shortage of the supply. And then what happened in May this year was that the 3rd wave of pandemics hit some ASEAN countries, especially Malaysia and Vietnam, that are also important producers of the chips. So at the moment, the chip shortage we are suffering is because of the lack of production in these countries that are under a very strong lockdown. So if each of these events happened singularly without the others, not much would happen. We would sneeze and we would not get this very serious flu. So unfortunately, we have this situation which then led, next slide please, to the situation that is widely discussed in the media. We have dozens of thousands of cars produced without chips, standing somewhere waiting for the components. Not only Škoda, but most of the manufacturers around the world are facing the same situation. I will ask for the next slide. It leads, of course, to longer waiting times for cars, to customer unsatisfaction, because it's not that the customers have to wait longer for the car. We are not even able to tell them when the car will come, because we don't know when we will get the chip. So this is something that we have never experienced in our lives, that we have such situation. But this is not only the cars, it's also other consumer electronic products where you see this shortage and long waiting times. And of course, this leads to shortfall in our production and to shortfall in our profitability in our suppliers. So of course, this is expanding throughout the whole value chain in automotive. So what are the solutions? And this is the last slide. So the solutions are, first of all, we will be most likely producing for some time models with equipment that requires less chips. So we will put less sophisticated equipment into the car. We will be also looking for alternative suppliers. We will be looking for more regional spread with our suppliers, more regional diversity. And also what we see is a need for production of some strategic components in Europe, because most of our production, when I speak for Škoda, is located in Europe. And now we are touching on the point that we discussed before, or Sebastian mentioned, that Europe needs production of some strategic components. And in the near future, it's going to be in the automotive industry, because it looks like the future is electric. So we are going through a transformation to clean mobility, which is in passenger cars mostly electric. So we will have 2 new crucial components. Of course, it's semiconductors again, because electric cars will not have less chips than combustion engine cars. They will probably have a little bit more chips, and also batteries and battery cells. Yeah? So what I think is in the best interest of Europe to have enough production of battery cells and semiconductors. We as automotive industry, we can take care of the batteries and battery cells. Volkswagen Group announced that we have planned to build 6 gigafactories to produce battery cells and final production of batteries. Production of semiconductors is so capital intensive and so special that we cannot get into that. So this is really something that we have to leave to our suppliers. But I think it's in the interest of the whole European economy to have a reasonable supply of semiconductors here on the continent. And with that, I would finish. I can only say this disruption of our operational business comes at a very unfortunate time, because we are now facing the transformation to the electric mobility, and we need good profit to invest into the new technology, into the new models. So you could hardly find a worse time for this to happen. But you cannot choose your disasters; they choose you. So this is something that we have to deal with. I know there was a question in the email that you sent me. what do I think about the future of the automotive industry in Europe and in Central Europe? I think it's okay. Yeah, this is a big hit, but we are used to crisis. We are used to big hits, so the industry will survive. It is unfortunate, but this is not something that would destroy the industry. Yeah? This is something that would stretch us a little bit, but this is definitely something that we can manage as industry. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe just a brief follow-up. I noticed last week a comment from the European Commission. Unfortunately, I forgot which commissioner it was or which commissioner's team, because it was deputy commissioner. And what he said was by 2024 or 25, European automotive should be self-sufficient when it comes to crucial components and materials. Is that something that you would sign? This kind of a very strong statement?
Well, if you believe in Santa Claus, you can sign this. Of course, we would wish to have that, but yeah, quite realistically, in 5 years, it's impossible to have enough capacity for batteries and chip in Europe. This is physically not possible. So I could wish that, but this is not going to come. If we are talking about self-sustainability in batteries, I think we can manage until 2030. In terms of chip, I cannot guarantee anything because this is not in our hands, speaking for the automotive industry. So it's up to the suppliers.
Thank you. Bublu, your opening remarks.
So thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to provide some response and some perspective on the discussion to date as someone from the university who researches and supports supply chains and studies them, and also for someone who was a supply chain manager in industry for 20 years, and certainly the critical 20 years after the wall fell, where Europe became what it did. I feel that we need to clarify a little bit of our expectations and our assumptions here when we talk about global value chains. And when I listen to this discussion, I hear, is the pandemic a game changer? What did the pandemic do exactly to our supply chains? And if I read the media, which I believe has influenced all of us and the best of us, including my colleagues at the university, I'm hearing things like the supply chain, the global supply chain has failed, as if it were one global supply chain. We're not talking about one. Every single company, every single firm, every single group, it has its own supply chains, and most firms have portfolios of supply chains to create different sets of responses and economics for different business models. So to simply generalize it to the global supply chain as if it were just about international trade and is a huge oversimplification. So I can only agree with you, Roman, that we should avoid oversimplification. At the same time, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but let's look at our language here. Baker and McKenzie is what Frau Javorcik showed, a study by them in which she said, do nations adjust, which nations have been surveyed to say they will redesign their supply chain. So my question to you is, do nations control supply chains or not? Is this not an completely absurd question? What will you do with this survey response? Will you create a public policy that will dictate to your company, sir, that you have to reshore everything? Do we want to go back to the bad old days of central planning? We know that doesn't work. So nations do not trade. It is firms that trade.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you there. That was me who showed the graphics.
Yeah.
And it's the companies from
those nations.
Given states. So it's not that states were polled, but companies were polled.
Exactly.
From these
so you need
states.
to differentiate, and that every single sector is different. So pharmaceutical supply chain is completely different from an automotive supply chain. An automotive supply chain is completely different from a textile and a garment supply chain. A garment supply chain is completely different from a bread or a beer supply chain. If we keep these things in mind, the configuration of that network, the way it works, how much it trades with, who it trades with, how complex its bills of materials are, will differ. So I don't think we should now speculate, especially in the media, of how to reconfigure them without having done any analysis. Every supply chain exists. The way it is today exists for a reason, because hundreds of people in every single organization have spent time analyzing and deciding what is the best economic outcome and what is the best outcome for the business model. And it is simply not true that it's all about greed or all about cutting wages or wage arbitrage. Wage, I'll give you some data here. Wage makes up, if we think that a product represents the wage level of the country it was made in, that is not true. Wage makes up, certainly in the electronics industry, when it was analyzed, about 10% of the cost of the product. The rest is the fully loaded cost of the supply chain, which involves much more than the transport costs, much more than inventory, much more than, it is a complex calculation. So let's look at this in a more complex manner. When I hear this discussion, we believe if we bring factories back, which, by the way, governments in every single country we've mentioned here, the US, the UK, Germany, India, France, and so on, has been talking about and put multi-billion dollar programs in place to bring factories back, okay, which is a fundamental redesign of the supply chain. All of those programs have failed. All of them, every single one, without exception. Obama's failed and Trump's failed. Global value chains make us richer, make companies more competitive because of specialization and trade. We are at a University of Economics. What I learned here in my class is that that is good for growth and that is good for competitiveness. So I'm going to read a few things here that my colleague and my colleagues have pointed out. Yossi Sheffi at MIT said we did not, the pandemic was not evidence that supply chains have failed. They were supply chains' finest hour. And he gave many examples of that. The Economist this year said that government-administered domestic supply chains are even less resilient than global ones. Resilience comes not from autarky, but from diverse sources of supply and constant private sector adaptation to shocks, which is exactly what Mr. Jan has said. They are doing, and they will do, and they will succeed. What Sebastian Mirodo wrote in 2020 is that firms that have diversified production and a production network across different countries can adjust their production when a disaster occurs in one place. So GVCs are the answer, they're not the problem. Okay, if we start, though, putting up trade barriers and tariffs, it is a tax on each one of us as a consumer. It's a hidden tax because the quality of your products will go down and the price will go up, and you will not be more certain at the end. The next pandemic or the next global crisis, we don't have that many global crises, by the way. We have had so many. In my career of 30 years, there has been a volcano exploding in Iceland, and that produced months of disruption of supply chains, and goods piled up in Shanghai. BMW stopped its factories. We stopped having food in the UK, and alarmingly, Ireland came very close to running out of medicine. Okay, but because of GVCs and the agile response of many different sources of supply and the agile response of the many different players in there, actually disaster was averted. We've seen chip shortages in the 80s and the 90s. I was there. DRAM ran out. When me at HP, we could not make our printers because the cell phones became electronic. So what you're seeing today is not the first time. And if you see a fancy picture of a big ship blocking a waterway, it's not proof that supply chains are fundamentally fragile or broken. Okay, so please be very careful. I guess I'll close that by saying diversification and reshoring are not the same thing. Okay, putting all your eggs in one basket does not diversify risk, even if the basket is home. That's Richard Baldwin. And I can only recommend that let's please clarify our questions, our root cause analyses, and remember what a great achievement it has been to create global trade and liberalization at this level. The world has become more prosperous and more resilient as a result of this. We do have to look at carbon, we do have to look at creating strategic stockpiles for medical supply. Okay? But that is a political question. That is not because the medical supply chain is broken. And I'm working on projects right now with countries to design how much to keep where and who's going to pay for it. There are certain tasks, but that is not fundamentally about international trade or reshoring. I don't see any country or any government setting up strategic stockpiles of chips, but maybe that will come. But definitely medical supply. Let's look at that and agricultural products, because food is like medicine. It is a fundamental that every single country needs all the time. So I think I've spoken a great deal. I hope that was helpful. Please ask me questions.
Will do. Thank you very much. Before I do so, though, let me just remind you, again, we have a question posed to you, dear ladies and gentlemen in the audience. The question is, can the supply chains be relocated to Europe? At the moment, 80% say no, along the lines of what you just were talking about, Bublu. 20% say yes. We're going to return to this question, but before we do so, Bublu, please try to put on your HP supply chain manager hat on. Should you experience the, let me simplify, pandemic crisis, as a HP supply manager, would you react somehow? Would there be, you know, from your perspective, would there be a need to restructure your supply chain, HP supply chain, or not?
Let me, okay, just for clarification, I haven't worked for HP in a long time. So let's talk about me as an imaginary manager, and I did do it. Like I said, the fact that we had a disruption, and HP in my tenure faced many disruptions. Why is this disruption in the paper? Why are we discussing it today? Why are lawyers and politicians and journalists, none of whom have any idea of how to design a supply chain? Why are we suddenly all experts? Okay, and I'll read you a few things from the paper just so that you know you can feel my pain. Why are we doing that? Because the disruptions in the past were B2B. All right? So if we ran out of chips, you didn't see the PCs disappearing off of the shelves. You were used to waiting a year for your iPhones at the beginning. So all of this that was going on in the background didn't come to your attention. But suddenly you went to the supermarket and there was no toilet paper. And you felt, okay, we need stress tests of supply chains. We need the government to step in, and so on and so forth. And these are very fast conclusions without analysis. I would say as an experienced supply chain manager, we need risk management strategies. We need, and there are good process innovations and good theories on how to manage your supply. And we used to call it procurement risk management. And the objective was assurance of supply. What doesn't assure supply, meaning business continuity of supply, is government interventions, a subsidized local uncompetitive supplier. We need suppliers we can count on. It's not about being cheap, it's about being good, reliable, predictable, and so on and so forth. Responsive, when I say I want it this way, make it that way. State-owned enterprises do not do that. I would simply claim so. They are not known for their competitiveness or their high performance or their ability to learn and solve problems, all right? And so it's nice that people yearn for a fixed income and a certain job. It does not help the economy. All right. So yes, we worked on risk management programs, and we actually succeeded in creating relationships and contracts with suppliers where we set up win-win. Win-win is absolutely necessary, so that when things go wrong, they give us the allocation first. All right, so if you've been squeezing your suppliers forever and ever, which is what we think GVCs do, you know, we beggar them, believe me, when the market changes, and it always changes, you won't get your allocation first, and you need to get it before your competitor, all right? And so these are some of the things I ask you to think about. It has not been researched well. Companies have, we had a good run since 2008. We've become very rich since that game changer back then, which changed nothing. And now we're suddenly thinking, oh yeah, we have to do something. We will forget this quickly and we will stop thinking about risk management. But we do have to do that. And I think policy can support that, but not by intervening in an unqualified manner in the design of the supply chain. Leave the managers to do their analysis and to do their jobs. They do it better than you because they just know more than you.
All right, thank you. Martin, do you expect the sort of a paradigm shift that many, and I'm going to go back to what Bublo was saying, now everybody is a supply chain expert, many claim to be the case, meaning that from purely economic aims, now it's much more about resilience in the reflection of, or in the context of political and geopolitical and other risks that are very difficult to model, but has to be factored in.
Yeah, so many things have been said. So first of all, when we talk about now creating tax barriers and tariffs, I think it started before the pandemics. Yeah? It was the clash between US and China, and then the fight for being #1, and that's how it started. It had not so much to do with pandemics, and actually the pandemic slowed that down because they both had other things to worry about. But back then, I was always saying that the globalization that they started talking about is very dangerous, not only from the business point of view, because I think globalization really brought the cost down and spread it wealth amongst the nations, even the poorest ones. It was also sort of a guarantee of peace, yeah? Because if two countries are so interdependent on each other, and they will not fight, they do not need conflicts. Yeah? And the US and China have been extremely interconnected in the supply chain. There was basically no way if they started a conflict they would all go down, because it was not possible. So I think globalization is also safeguarding peace, and therefore we should keep it. So that's on this point. Second point, I would speak more as a citizen or as an economist, and I have spent. I just came back from China last year, and the first 6 months of the pandemics I spent in China in lockdown, and in the end of 19 and beginning of 20, I flew back and forth between Europe and US and China several times. Basically, when the pandemics was popping up. And I have to give a big credit to supply chains because let's face it, none of us really faced a big discomfort. If you think about what we are talking about, huge pandemics and everything, did you wear a couple of days without water, electricity, without food? Did you? Yeah, not even here, basically in any country. I know that maybe in India the first wave was pretty tough. It was different, but in the US, in Europe, in China, and I spent in North China in lockdown 5 months, and there was not a single day that I didn't have fresh fruits or whatever. It's unbelievable how the supply chains worked, yeah? And the supply chains changed. Obviously, the food delivery, grocery delivery. This is a new business. Yeah, there is a paradigm change in how we order food now. That this is true, but there was never ever a discomfort. So I think this pandemic was basically a wake-up call, because if the death rate was different, was harder, then we would have a problem. Yeah? But with this, it was basically we managed as a society in a very comfortable way. And the last thing that I will say about this is with the chips. Now I wonder why nobody saw it coming. Yeah? One of the words of this century is smart. You have smart home, smart grid, smart city, smart work, smart home. It had to be clear to everybody that with this smartness you will need chips for everything. Yeah? You have chips in everything, and more and more. Not only in the car, in your fridge, in your hair dryer, probably. I don't know. I don't use one, but I'm sure there are some. Everything is smart, so it was clear that there will be a much bigger demand for chips, but the supply is not there. So I think we have to ask ourselves why did that happen? Why nobody invested more into the capacity for chips? But I think we will manage. There will be ways how to work around this. It might cool down slightly the economic growth, very slightly, but this is not a disaster. I would not even call this a crisis. I'm speaking on behalf of the industry that was hit most. So for us, maybe it's a small disaster, but we will get over it. So I also believe there is nothing fundamentally wrong with the supply chains. We just have to diversify risk more. And in terms of Europe, I don't think that the European Commission or the states should dictate to the companies what to do. But as a sort of a smart industrial policy that would focus on the sectors that we need, focusing the technical education, focusing the R&D activities, focusing the development of production capacities in these things that I mentioned, maybe for pharmaceutical industry, it's something else. But some sort of a smart industrial policy would not harm Europe. Yeah? But in general, I think it's not a crisis, it's not a disaster, it's not the end of the world.
Thank you. A question from the audience for Sebastian, and it actually nicely follows the logic or what Martin just said, the sort of a narrative. Should CE region focus more on participation, value capture, inclusiveness, or resilience? The author is referring to latest JIBP that discussed the GVC-oriented policies. In other words, what should we do to actually utilize the potential opportunities that are always there when there are certain turbulences of any kind?
Yes, I mean, of course, you always learn from a crisis. And again,
hopefully.
yes, and again, there will be lessons learned from the pandemic. Maybe not in terms of changing the whole geography of value chains, but like Martin was mentioning this question, why we did not produce enough ships. So you have the question of forecasting. So why there were so many errors in the forecasting of demand. So of course you can say the pandemic was quite an exceptional event. But so you can think that firms will improve their risk management strategies and will draw lessons that will not change maybe radically the way they produce, but fine-tune and do better when is the next crisis. But your question was also about the next challenges, how you incorporate inclusiveness, how also we discussed in the previous session climate change. So there are new challenges. So we have to rethink GVCs, and again, it's more the firms that can rethink the GVCs, but you have also in the background a lot of regulation, and so policymakers, so I agree with what Bulu said, that the value chains are designed by the firm, but they also operate in a regulatory environment, and the government are the ones in charge of this regulatory environment. So there is a question of how you can incorporate these new dimensions of sustainability, inclusiveness. I mean, part of it is coming from the firms. You have all this discussion about responsible business conduct. You have a lot of private standards. You have also, of course, a role for government, maybe a role also for trade agreements. So these are challenges. So you can say because of the pandemic, maybe we will think more about these coming challenges. They are not directly derived from the experience of the pandemic. But we have to think that the GVC-oriented policies may be different from what we have seen. So at the beginning, people thinking about GVC policies were thinking how I can increase the participation of my country in global value chains. Then it moved to a slightly different question, which is how maybe I can capture more value, because you can participate, but also all participants don't get the same income. So what are the policies that can improve my participation, but also give more income to my country? And now there is a shift also to how I address the consistency between this globalization and other important policy goals in terms of inclusiveness, sustainability. So that's a challenge, both for the firms and for the governments. And so out of this, I would imagine that the GVCs will change, and also the GVC-oriented policies will change.
Speaking of the government policies, what should be the lesson learned, sort of a take from the current experience? What should the Czech government do or not do? Let me put it this way.
I think in terms of what policymakers can do, there are 4 things. And, at OECD, we talk about the 4 keys to resilient supply chains. But first, it's about anticipating risk. And we saw that some firms have very good risk management strategies. Some had even some special plans for when there is a pandemic. But governments were somehow, I mean, again, you have differences, but looked less prepared for this type of crisis, and also for the implications for the transport infrastructure, for the logistics, for the global value chain. So in the future, government will have to also have their own government-level risk management strategies that will incorporate this dimension and think about how to keep trade routes open in particular. So that's the first axis. Then government can also invest in infrastructure, in digital infrastructure. So that's also how you can support the efforts of private firms to be more resilient. Also, I've mentioned regulations. What we've seen, and actually some governments have experimented this during the pandemic, is what we call regulatory flexibility. So you have rules and you need to quickly adjust them to mitigate the impact of the crisis, which is not always easy because of the legislative process or the way rules are set. So there is some thinking about this regulatory flexibility, how you implement it, how at the same time you don't somehow create different standards for during the crisis. The third thing governments can do is cooperating with the private sector. And one can think for most of the issues we have discussed, including the shortages, it's a lot about public-private cooperation, because again, that's not the governments that design or organize the value chains, but governments can say, well, we have a problem, and talk to the private sector and see how this problem can be solved. So you can think that, and it's a challenge because it's somehow easy to do it with domestic firms, but with the global value chains, it should also include some foreign firms. So that's where it's challenging to have a dialogue between governments and all the firms involved in a given value chains. And lastly, it's about international cooperation. And again, a lot of the problems we are discussing, you have solutions in international cooperation.
Thank you. A question that came from the audience again, and it nicely works with what you just said, or actually addresses some of the key issues you just mentioned. In the smart industrial policy, can we focus on what we need, or is it crucial what we can, what we are good at? Question to you all. What would you pursue? Would you try to work what you already have and better it, or would you try for some sort of a revolutionary improvement? Let me put it this way.
On a principle, you must build on what you do well. Okay, so the specialization that you build on your local endowments, I think you must. That's not it's a non-negotiable. The question is, you still have to have a strategy for the things you need. Okay, and so that is quite clear. It doesn't mean you then shift all of your resources into that. Okay, but so again, that doesn't mean like bringing factories here where you're not good at production and you can't do it cheaply, you can't do it reliably. There's no point entering something where you have no competence, no capacity, no competitiveness. But you do have to have a strategy to assure that supply. Okay, so we still come back to that, so I think one is a strategic question where you have to have strategies in place, maybe contingency plans, maybe strategic stockpiles. I'm very cautious about strategic stockpiles because, as soon as the crisis, we take crisis management and we mix it up with long-term policy, and it's not the same thing, okay? We forget very quickly the crisis when all of a sudden we can go out and none of us are wearing masks here today, right? So we've already forgotten that deathly fear of contagion. All right, how quickly we've forgotten. And this, this country was traumatized by that contagion. So short-term crisis management is not the same thing as long-term policy strategy. Yeah, you're gonna have to have a strategy. I don't know, what the division of labor will be between private enterprise and the government. Government creates the right boundary conditions. Okay, it has to create freedom of trade, has to create freedom so they can make rational decisions. You do not force them into irrational decisions that create more problems than anything. Yes, I hope that explains a little bit. It sounds vague, but you can and you should have strategies for the things you absolutely need. And so I think you need assurance of supply in medical, and I think you need assurance of supply in agricultural and food. I know that Switzerland has centralized national stockpiles of both. And it's not the same as being an autark economy. That is risk mitigation at the federal level. And what they always made sure of, and I only found this out by accident, they're not good at vaccinating their people. They cost way too much money to treat a patient, but what they have is unbelievable excess capacity in hospital beds. Every hospital bed has an oxygen supply, every single one. So there was no need to go out and scramble and hoard ventilators, even though they have the world's best ventilator maker in the country. So yeah, you need both. Does that help? You agree, Sebastian?
Okay, Sebastian.
No,
Since Bubu essentially addressed.
Yes, no, I agree. I just wanted to add that on these strategies is also the question of coordination across countries. So like if every country has its own stockpiles, and if the stockpile is maybe on the final product, it may be less efficient if it's coordinated and if it's on the input. So for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, they believe that the best strategy is to stockpile some of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that will allow you to produce quickly different medicines. But then when you have identified the crisis, you can quickly react and use these inputs to produce the final medicines. And also you can stock generally these active pharmaceutical ingredients for a longer time than the final products. So there is a question of at what level you create the stockpile and how you coordinate it so that it's efficient. So that's where also I see an important role for governments in cooperation with the private sector.
By the way, what Sebastian just explained right now is a superb risk management strategy that comes out of supply chain practice. And it was invented in the 80s. It's called postponement, okay? So it's very difficult to predict how much of the finished product you need. So you don't know, you will always be stocking the wrong thing when the demand actually comes in. But if you do the risk pooling, meaning you forecast what the whole demand will be, it's, you know, at a more generic level, the forecast inaccuracy goes way down, and it will be, you react, you finish it at the last minute. And he's right, you know, governments could work with the private sector to create postponement processes and just stock the essential ingredients that are at risk of allocation when the supply collapses. And so these are processes that are known. Infinitely more sophisticated than just saying, oh, we'll just build a factory here. Because the factory will still then be stuck looking for those raw materials. You are not reducing risk by just saying it's going to be here at home. And when all of your country locks down, those factory workers cannot go to work either. So you haven't helped yourself one little bit.
Thank you. Martin?
I think with industrial policy, it's always like this. You use what you can do now to finance what you can do tomorrow, yeah? Because you still need a solid basis, because the industrial policy, which needs some investments into R&D or education or incentives, you first have to create some income and some taxes to pay for that. So you have to maintain what you have, but you have to invest into what you will need in the future. Like Czech Republic was always very strong in mechanical engineering, which was also a base for automotive. But now we see that there are new sectors emerging, like nanotechnology, like software in the Czech Republic. But they will be needed for the automotive industry in the future, because you will have more and more software in cars. So that's fine. And maybe we have to go back to chemical engineering, which was also very strong in the past, maybe not so much now, but with the battery technology you will again need chemical engineering. Yeah? So you always have to look forward to see what kind of sectors, what kind of technology I will need in the next phase. Because if we stick to combustion cars, being happy that we are very strong in mechanical engineering, it will not get us to the next decade, to the next century. So it's always a combination of these two.
Will, again from the audience, will electromobility make us more or less reliant on Asian suppliers, or more exposed, let me put it in more general terms?
Not necessarily. I mean, for a certain period of time, maybe, but as I said, we are planning to build at least 6 gigafactories for battery cells. We can create this technology here, so we can be self-sustainable. Not now, but in 5 to 10 years, yes. In terms of chips, we are very much dependent on Asia already today, so it does not change much. There are more chips in electric cars than in combustion engine cars, but it's not a multiple. It's a few more. It's not like it's 3 times, 4 times. Yeah? And so I don't think that the electric mobility would necessarily make us dependent on Europe more, on Asia more.
And I'll get back to the first question I posed, and that is the strategy, let's say the national strategy. We have approximately 1,000 strategies here in the Czech Republic. So let's assume somewhere is being written the 1,001st strategy. If you had a chance to include something on behalf of Skoda Auto, or more generally automotive, what would it be? What should be the part of the strategy number 1001? That reflects upon what we just experienced or are still experiencing and expect to happen next.
I think I wrote 3 of those 1,000.
I know.
And it's still, since the first one that I wrote, it still boils down to 2 things. One is people. If we are missing something, if there is a lack of some resource, it's people. Material you will bring sooner or later, even if you have a day or a week or a month's delay, the supply guys will get it. If you don't have people, nobody will bring them. Yeah? So if you have one limiting factor for the growth of the industry here, or for the growth of the economy, it's skilled people. Yeah? So it's basically a policy focused on skilled people, bringing talents from abroad, investing into the right education. And keeping the talent here. So that's one point. And second point is support of the research cooperation between private sector and public institution. There is still not enough. It's better than it was, but there is still not enough money in it. Yeah. So applied research, very strong cooperation between university institutions and industry is the second one.
I'm tempted to ask why is it still not happening here in the Czech Republic, but that's probably the question for somebody else, not our panelist or today's panelist. Bublu, this was, let's say, the perspective from the system, or this was the systemic level perspective, let's say, a take from one of the key players in the Czech Republic. When we look at the same issue from the perspective of small and mid-sized companies, and I'm asking for your Swiss experience, let's say best practices, because for the Czech Republic and the Czech economy, the small and mid-sized companies are the backbone, are very important, and sometimes it seems to me they're lacking the experience, the global context and the knowledge. So if you had a chance to actually speak directly to them, which you have, we have a camera over there, what would be your wise words?
Oh, I can't promise wisdom, but let me share my thoughts. I just checked on this, so I think you're asking me because Switzerland, like Germany and Austria and parts of the Nordic countries, are very much driven by SMEs, all right? And all these small countries are deeply embedded and dependent on global value chains. Okay, so they are suppliers, almost. So these are all suppliers into value chain. So they supply their customers and they import and they themselves are customers of their suppliers. So yes, I looked at the 2020 statistics from the Statistische Bundesamt this morning, and of Switzerland has a total of 592,695 firms, of which 9,206 are SMEs. Actually, by their definition, over 90% of firms there are SMEs. All right. And so, and if you think of GDP in Switzerland as being this huge outsized things, obviously this is an engine of growth and GDP in this country. We think of Roche, we think of Nestle, we think of Philip Morris. All of these gigantic monsters exist, but GVCs and globalization and global trade is not just about them. When you look at the hidden champions, and that's what we call them, they have no public profile. You don't know they exist. They are B2B. They are highly specialized, which is why they're successful. They occupy niches, and they tend to dominate well over 50% of the world market, even though they're Swiss. So the highest wage level in the world. All right? That should make no sense. None of them should be located in Switzerland, so they do. But they are evidenced by the mere fact that they exist and they are profitable, as they are evidence that you can have supply chain design and business models and business strategies that make you successful through specialization and trade. All right, so I think SMEs are part of the future, and I think they definitely can be part of the future. I do not see, I don't see the reason why every country should want to produce a Facebook, which, by the way, I do not see that as like the be-all and end-all yeah. So there are other ways to add value and be successful in GVCs and not just be slaves to large MNEs. And if you look at the research, they only talk about MNEs, multinational enterprises. And with that, we don't mean these little companies, even though they are multinational enterprises. We think of Nestle and all the evil we associate with them. But you can be very low profile and very, very successful. And these business models, I think, could be very successful in the Czech Republic. If I may agree with my colleagues and with the speakers from the previous session, education will be key. That is the long-term investment and the public-private partnership in research. And what I can tell you from personal experience, because I'm at the heart of this, at the dead heart of this, our universities and education systems, our school systems are set up for the last century and the last industrial revolution. They are not set up for what our children are facing now. Absolutely not. It's so much better. Europe has made everything so much better for our children. I see it in my children. You know, this generation, you are so much more agile, so much more in tune with what is happening in the world than we are, okay? You have the skills that are missing in the 55 plus, which is me, right? But our education does not serve you well to face the future. And we have to change that. The way we lecture, the way we research, the way we diffuse innovation is not fit for the times. And I think we need reform in these structures. I think we need more close partnerships with companies, because companies are training their own people because they're saying what I'm getting out of the universities are useless. You know, or the apprenticeship system in Switzerland is good, but they discuss it every single year, saying, should we stop this? Should everyone not, you know, shouldn't we be doing something better? And I said, you're the ones everyone's trying to copy. But please, let's reform that. Let's invest in that future. There's no way to avoid that. So if you ask me, that's it. But, and I'm sorry I'm part of the problem. I'm at the, so. Sebastian, what do you think?
Thank you.
Poor guy. I put him on the spot.
Bublu wants you to admit that you're part of the problem as well. Let me ask second to last question. It's a question to all of you, or for all of you, and that is, what is going to change then? Is there going to be a change? Because the whole premise was, you know, the pandemic is an accelerator of certain trends. We were talking about some of the trends, and there will be some sort of a change. Now, at least some of the stuff I've heard on this panel somehow goes against this mainstream flow. So to what extent will be the post-pandemic normal or abnormal, let me put it that way, different, or in which ways it will differ from what we were used to before the pandemic hit, and in which ways it will be the same? Sebastian.
Well, it will be the same and different. So what we have discussed is somehow whether we would move from a world of global value chains to a world without global value chains, or with shorter value chains, or we are reshoring. So this, I don't believe it's the case. So we will continue to have a global value chains, to have international production, multinational companies. So this will not change. But of course, the way they organize their production, the kind of business models, will continue to change with the technological progress, the digital transformation. There are many other trends that we have not mentioned, but at OECD we did a lot of work on what we call the servicification of manufacturing, but the fact that more and more the companies that produce goods try to add services. And it's a change in the organization of value chains, because for services you have to be closer to the consumers. There are very important changes related to the aging of societies. So older people don't consume the same thing as the younger people. So again, a shift in terms of the product that will be sold, and so that will have to be produced. So these kind of changes, some of them we can anticipate because these are long structural trends. Others, it will come from some crises, some shocks. Again, when we talk about climate change, it's something that we can anticipate, but also we don't know yet what will be the crisis out of climate change, and how countries will react, and how it will really shift the organization of production. So this will lead to certainly many changes in global value chains, but the global value chains will remain global. And what I would like to say also is that one of the reasons we have this kind of organization of production is because products are more and more complex and sophisticated. It was illustrated with the car industry. So it's impossible for such complex products to have all the companies, all the people with the expertise in your country, even when you're a very large economy like the US or China. So it will continue to be an interdependent world. So what we have discussed is, yes, you have some risk, vulnerabilities related to these interdependencies, but it's also difficult to imagine that you can produce such sophisticated products without these interdependencies. So we will have to deal with them. But as long as we don't go back to consuming very basic products, we will need the global value chains, and they will change according to the shift we see in technological leadership, in talents, in skills, in cost. I mean, it's many economic determinants that will determine how they are organized.
Thank you. Martin, how Skoda Auto is going to differ, and when it comes to inner workings, its inner workings, processes, and how the automotive industry is going to change or look like? What are the key issues you would mention in this context?
I think in terms of supply chain, if you should stick to the supply chain, not to the whole value chain, I think what you might see in the supply chain is more diversification, so having the production of components in more continents, because if we put all the chips into Europe and then you have a problem in Europe, then we will not have chips again, so this is not the solution. So regional diversification and vertical integration. I mean, some companies will probably think about more vertical integration, where you see that the companies who have more control of part of the supply chain might have in better control in such situations. So, but I think in general the whole business model will not completely change. This is not a paradigm of Excel that would change completely everything. We will more see changes in our private life. I think there will be more digitalization, more working from home, different travel, different supply chain in terms of groceries, food and stuff like that. What we see. So that's how I see it.
When it comes to consumer experience, is there going to be some sort of a change vis-a-vis a car? Because you mentioned, I think, during the break that, for instance, right now you don't even know when the car is going to be available, of course, because of the chip,
yes,
right?
but this is a timely limited.
It's abnormal,
thing,
absolutely.
This is abnormal, and it's very unpleasant for us, but we will come back to normal, where you will order a car, you will know it comes in 2 months, 3 months, or 6 months. So I think it put focus more back on the passenger car, where I think many people were saying the young generation does not want to have a passenger car, and we will be sharing a car, and I think we are going back to a little bit away from sharing. Yeah? Things like car sharing, also Airbnb, and these things, they suffered a little bit. So I think that it slowed down a trend of sharing everything, because I want to have my own bubble, I want to have my own space back. So, yeah, but in terms of what customers are expecting from a car, it will change, but it does not have to do with the pandemics. Yeah? They expect that the car will be smarter, that it will be more autonomous, that it will be cleaner. Yeah? But these are the things that are coming anyway, despite pandemics.
All right. Thank you. Bublu, what do you expect the future to hold for us?
I'm not sure I understood your question, Roman.
The question is, once the normal or abnormal is here, how it's going to differ from what we were used to before the pandemic?
Okay, I think the pandemic was a global health crisis. Okay, it changed the mobility of workers, and it created sort of backlogs, and it changed material flows, and obviously because we had to avoid death, we had to do different things in our daily life, and that created an economic crisis. It did not, in our opinion, I would generalize, it did not show a fundamental weakness in the way we did things. Actually, the response was heroic, and I tend to agree with what was said here, that we didn't suffer as much as we could have. So I think the pandemic itself will not re-change everything that we do. We will see some changes in behavior, consumer behavior, and sort of lifestyle behavior. I think all of us realized that we felt differently being at home and traveling less and so on, and consuming less. I was just speaking to my student there, and he said, we realize we don't need to buy new clothes every season, that none of that matters. And some people started reading more, and so on and so forth. I think that we have to see this in the theater of change that we've seen since 1988. Okay, and that's what global value chains have been doing since 1988, with the opening up of China, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, I was personally here. I arrived in Europe in 1988, and I was amazed. I was wondering why everyone was crying on the streets of Germany when the wall fell. And I said, why are you crying? They said, the wall fell. And I was like, okay, is this a reason to cry? Is this a reason to cry? And they said, yes, this is a reason to cry. And so think of what your country has gone through since then. You have seen a galloping pace of change across all things, and it's reflected in the economy, which is what we're talking about. But yes, we've seen more peace, we've seen more prosperity. What we're seeing, we're walking into a climate disaster. That has nothing to do with the pandemic, okay? And some people say, yeah, if we didn't have global trade, we wouldn't have had this global contagion. I don't believe that. I think we will see more global health crises. So I think we're gonna have to have governments working together with response plans for that. What I find absolutely outrageous and unacceptable is the vaccine nationalism, as if we believe if we vaccinate our country, we'll be fine, and we have to vaccinate. Nobody's safe until everybody's safe. So we're going to have to look at things differently, but I think if this is a wake-up call to firms and to policymakers to have sophisticated, intelligent, well-analyzed risk strategies in place, then I think that would be a great educational experience. If we learn from our trauma, I don't know if that will happen, but I would be very happy if it did. And so I would be very unhappy if we end up with sort of hasty, unanalyzed rushes to reconfigure everything. I think we have to be thoughtful and strategic.
Okay, can I just quickly comment on this? I think the biggest problem was not the inability of the governments and or pharma companies to produce enough vaccines quickly, or the vaccine. How did you call it? The nationalism. The problem is that people don't want to get vaccinated. Now you have enough vaccines, yeah, but you still, most of the countries are at 50%, you know, the best gets.
It's a disgrace.
Yeah, so this is the problem is the approach of the people and how the society behaves. It's much bigger than the incompetency of the government.
I would contradict you in that the US and rich countries are stockpiling huge excess of vaccine. It is expiring. And I'm working with the Ministry of Health in Uganda right now. They don't have vaccine. We have to get it to them urgently. And we have to get it to the poor countries urgently. We are stockpiling for what? You know, we have enough for every person, and then the rest has to go to the rest of the world. And that's the only way we will bring the curve down and prevent the fourth and the fifth wave and the Delta and the Gamma and the, you know, and the Omega versions. They are all coming our way, and we think, you know, I don't understand how we believe we will be spared.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you that the vaccines should be fairly shared. I'm just saying that the biggest problem is that 50% of the population, basically, even if there is enough vaccines, do not want to get vaccinated.
Before I ask the final question, ladies and gentlemen, any questions from the audience, please? Do we have a microphone, please, for the lady here? Thank you. Somebody else? Just so I know. Okay, second to last.
Javorcik, I'm from Faculty of International Relations. I just wanted to ask about one thing. There is a lot of discussion about relocation of production, but I don't see enough attention given to raw materials. And we cannot relocate raw materials. We already had such a situation many years ago when China put export quotas on rare earth minerals. Now we have batteries, we have other minerals we need, such as cobalt. I don't think we pay enough attention, and this can be other problem in the world economy of who produces it, often Africa, but who controls it, which is China. So what do you think about that? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. Martin, can you address it from the perspective of Scorauto?
I share your concerns. Interestingly, there has never been a shortage of production based off a shortage of raw materials. If there was, maybe there were some isolated cases. There was not a major disruption. So somehow it always works with the raw materials. I think the answer to your question is first in new technologies. I mean, there will be batteries without cobalt. That's one thing, that you will use raw materials that are not so difficult to obtain. And of course, the solution is also in recycling. We have to go much more into recycling, where we know with the batteries for electric cars, I think we will be able to recycle 80–90% in about 5 years. So there is a period now where we have to learn, but basically recycling is a big answer to this. And we as Škoda, and I think the whole automotive industry will slowly go to using bio and recycled materials in the interior. I think in 10 years you will have most of the materials in the interior of the car somehow recycled or bio, and you will have vegan cars. Yeah, so this is also the paradigm shift in the industry. So these are the answers.
Thank you. Bublu, Sebastian, do you want to add something to it? No? Okay. Last question, circling back to the original question we posed to the audience, meaning can the supply chains be relocated to Europe? Now I'm going to modify this question because you already answered that. And my question is a follow-up to the first one. When it comes to Europe and the new normal, are there going to be any significant changes when it comes to the length of supply chains or global value chains in more general terms, the way Europe works as an economic entity, if you will? You know, any changes to business as usual, meaning it's not going to be business as usual after all. Sebastian?
Yes, I mean, as I explained, Europe is different. I mean, first, that's the region where there is the highest level of economic integration, where the global value chains are the longer. Of course, because when you call global the inputs, I mean, when you include the inputs coming from other European countries, so if you look at the EU as a bloc, it may be similar to US or Japan. So it's a bit artificial because we look at global value chain, including the intra-European value chain. But this, I think, will not change. And out of the European integration process, you have a very important economic gain, so you have also no reason to try to do things differently. But what I would like to say is that when the way the question is asked, can the supply chains be relocated to Europe? I mean, it's not a zero-sum game. So it's not like you take it from China, it goes back to Europe. The question for Europe is more about the specialization and what will the European industries look like in the future and how Europe will participate in existing value chains. So it's a different way, I think, of answering the question. And for sure, based on research, development, investment in intangible assets, there are many opportunities for Europe to play an important role. But again, it doesn't mean that all value chains will become EU, but EU will find a specialization, and there are many countries specialized in different parts, different value chains. So there will continue to be many opportunities, but the question for the policymakers is more about how to make sure that the specialization will continue to allow European companies to be part of these global value chains.
Thank you. Bublu?
I think you said it all.
All right, thank you. Martin, last word is yours.
Yeah, I've been, it will be in a way positive. I've been in my life to many conferences about new normal, and I realized that the new normal is always a short period before the new crisis comes, and we are basically living in a constant disruption. But what I have noticed is that the world is somehow able to manage the crisis, or what we call a crisis, in a way that you still have a constant improvement of wealth and GDP and however you want to measure the economic output. So somehow we, the society, managed to learn to deal with the crisis and always come out stronger. So I think the resilience, which was one of the words, it shows that people are resilient, and we just have to face the next challenge and be agile and get ready for that. There is no new normal. There is just a constant disruption.
Where do you see Europe in this chaotic world of today and tomorrow? Because there are, you know, I would even dare to say there are two camps, those that predict the worst and those that are maybe way too optimistic.
I think Europe is extremely resilient. Europe has a huge diversity. I had a chance to live in the US for a long time, in China for a long time, in Russia. It depends on whether you count Russia to Europe or not. But I think the old Europe is extremely diverse, extremely strong, and provides extremely good quality of life. Yeah, so some people write of Europe. I believe Europe is the best continent in the world. I would not want to live anywhere else. I think Europe is doing well. It could do a bit better if we were a bit smarter, but in general, Europe is okay.
Thank you. Food for your thought, and we are having food for your bellies next door. So let me officially end with Martin being very optimistic, or at least optimistic, which is good in these dark times. I don't want to say dark ages. Martin Jan, Skoda Auto. Bublu Thakur, ETH Zurich. And Sebastian Merdu, OECD. Thank you very much. Thanks to you. Again, you're more than welcome to join us next door for the informal part of today's conference. And in a year, unless something really bad surprises us, I will see you. Looking forward to it.